It is often assumed that lack of respect for human rights is caused by lack of political will. But it can also be economic reasons. Attiya Waris from Kenya is an expert on the link between taxation and violation of human rights. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a real honor to be here, and it's going to be a very different lecture from the previous one, so hopefully we'll make some connections, but I'm not sure how many. In 2006, when I first started working with tax and human rights, everybody thought I was crazy, and I think people still think I'm crazy, which is fine. But one of the biggest challenges that I faced when I said there's a connection between tax and human rights was that I had to prove it. I had to show that there actually was a connection. And then I had to convince people that there was a connection. And of course, this is an ongoing process. And for people who work in human rights, it's very easy to say that you need money. You need money to build a courtroom, so that's civil and political rights. On the other hand, you need money to put medicines in a hospital, and that's economic, social, and cultural rights. And so the human rights lobbies were very quick to agree that yes, rights require resources. But the traders and the business people were less convinced. And as times have gone on and we've hit the 2009 financial crisis, it means that there's even fewer people that feel that they need to spend more money on what they perceive as ideal. And so I'm going to try and walk you through what I've thought about over the past couple of years on what the link is, not only between tax and human rights, but also with reference to democracy. So I was asked to talk about why tax is important, but also why it's important for state building. And so I will look at it both at the domestic level, but I will also talk a little bit about the international level. And with specific reference to Kenya, we'll look at what sort of revenue resources have been doing for the past 10 years very briefly, because data has been one of the biggest challenges there. And then how to improve tax collection on the African continent, and hopefully then make a link to achieving rights like the ones that were discussed earlier. I'm also going to try and look at not only how projects have positively contributed, but also the ones that are a little bit negative, and finally, how you can keep giving more money for this. So, why is tax important? And because I believe in human rights, and I think it's an extremely good principle. Rights require resources, but for some reason, that very small statement with 3 words is actually not mentioned in any of the international treaties or documents. In fact, it was deliberately left out because of the whole debate between the capitalist and the communist bloc at the time when the covenants were being debated. And the result of that is that you have these 2 phrases that are floating around in human rights, which is immediate realization and progressive realization, which we've now all realized means absolutely nothing because none of these rights are actually realized. So immediate obviously is not immediate, and therefore if immediate has not taken place, then when will progressive take place? Should immediate come before progressive? And this is a big debate in human rights. But tax is important because that's where you get the money for it, and it helps in self-reliance at a domestic level. So after the 2009 fiscal crisis, a lot of countries were debating about how to improve their tax collection so that they could actually begin to achieve development. And in many African countries, unfortunately, some are 100% aid based, including budget aid. On the other hand, some are about 40 or 50%. A country like Kenya takes about 20% budgetary aid, and then all the other aid comes outside the budget, of course. And out of that 100% bundle of resources, we've hit, I think, 1 trillion shillings now. The 20% goes to development, and 80% goes to recurrent, or maintaining your civil service and your infrastructure and your employees. And if 80% of the total resources of a country, or even 100%, go in maintaining the existing infrastructure of a state, obviously you're not going to have more kindergartens so that ladies can work. You're not going to have more roads. You're not going to have more hospitals being built. You're certainly not going to have more schools because you only have that 20%, and priorities start to take, they take different levels as a result. I think the other importance of tax is that it builds confidence or trust in a government. And as long as you hear discussions on corruption and money laundering and tax evasion and governments allowing negotiation on taxes to reduce burdens, especially of, for example, multinational corporations have been mostly in the limelight recently, then the problem is that they will break the confidence or the trust that a people has in their government. And from an African perspective, this is still problematic because many Africans don't really know what country they belong to. There's still debates on borders. There's still debates on where people belong. And if you live in the outlying regions of a particular country, it's very likely that you don't have a passport. You never intend to travel. You're lucky if you've accessed a national identity card. And so you don't really care about this central government somewhere in a capital far away. And if there isn't that connection between people, and there isn't that taking in of tax and then releasing of some kind of services, there isn't the building of this relationship between a state and its people. And this is one dilemma that I think we are having in Africa currently. After the 2009 fiscal crisis, there was also the problem with charity or aid. There's less and less money available around the world. From a tax perspective, this is debatable because there are now a lot of discussions about the loopholes that exist within taxation and companies, for example, or people that are evading taxes or avoiding them, and the need to therefore reduce that completely. So, do we really have fewer resources, or is it that people are more clever at negotiating how much tax to pay? But whichever decision you come to, either way, the end of the day, this need to be self-reliant exists within every human being. Nobody likes to put out a hand and ask for charity. And this whole charity aid discussion has led to a lot of, a very big push in many African countries in trying to increase their tax bases so that there is less reliance, which I think is a good thing. But there's also communal development, and in human rights, the language that is used there is participation. So right to development has participation and community participation, and in tax, they talk about development and communal development and getting people to come together and decide what they want to do with their money. And as much as other forms of resources can have an impact on a state, tax is the one that has been proved to have the biggest impact because people see their money going and then make demands for it afterwards. So that would be the general importance that I would like to take us forward with. But specifically for state building, the work that I've done touches on fiscal legitimacy, how to legitimize a state and therefore how to build a state. And there are some things that are very common. They're the good governance principles: accountability, transparency, responsibility. Those are quickly up there. But then this legitimacy can also be further broken down, not only into equality and equity, because you have to have equality between the peoples, not only how you collect, but also how you distribute, but equity in the sense that those that have more need potentially less as well. And then there has to be fairness and justice in that system. Now, fairness sometimes exists in tax discussions, but justice certainly doesn't. Justice is something that has come out very much from the civil society movements across the world working on tax issues like the Tax Justice Network. But within tax principles, justice is something that has been subsumed for a very long time. It was in the principles of taxation maybe in the 10th century or the 8th century across different parts of the world. But it certainly isn't there anymore. And that absence of a feeling of fairness and justice within a tax system is what I think begins to undermine it and undermines that connection with human rights. So there is an improved collection of revenue in Africa, and there's a lot of debate as to why. And the best example I can give you is actually Kenya. So Kenya's managed to increase its tax collection progressively by about 5%, sometimes 10% over the past 10 years. And there have been different reasons to explain why. One of the reasons that they've given has been that there's been a change in the administrative structure in the Revenue Authority. So we've moved from a revenue collection agency that is within a Ministry of Finance to being a sort of a semi-autonomous body. But it is debatable how effective it is. There was an immediate jump in resources, but now the same institution, because it's semi-autonomous, doesn't have linkages back with the Ministry of Finance and has actually broken the link on international taxation. So for domestic taxation, they do very well, but for any type of interaction with the Ministry of Trade or Finance, that has now disappeared because there isn't that linkage and they're not allowed to interact at some levels. Many countries in Africa, and Kenya most recently in August, declared themselves as middle-income countries. But what is strange about this declaration, at least from my perspective, was that it isn't that there was a sudden spurt of growth in the continent or in particular countries, but rather they changed the statistical analysis of it. I don't know how many of you are conversant with statistics, but they use a base rate. And so they moved their base rate from 2000 to 2009, and that simple shift basically meant that they reassessed all their statistical data, and suddenly we're a middle-income country. And everybody on the streets in Nairobi were like, so do we have more money now? And of course, my answer was, do you think you have more money now? And no, well, of course we didn't. But it feels more like there is some kind of a political race within the continent between the big economic states like the South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya. Egypt, I think less so now, but the three bigger economies are always trying to compete with each other. And since Nigeria declared middle income status in April, now, we've got to catch up. I'm so sorry, we have to do that. So there is the revenue growth, but it's not clear whether the revenue growth is because of an actual change or just because we're updating statistics. And I think it is debatable. But let's look at human rights. And the best one that I would like to look at is probably the right to health. I think that the right to health is one of the most critical human rights that exists, because if you don't have a healthy population, then your population cannot really do much. And if you look at statistical data across the continent, then most African countries are not spending more than 5% of their budget on health. And in Kenya, it is between 2 and 3%. And this is terrible because in Norway, it's 50%. Did you know that? And frankly, I was blown away when I realized the difference. And I think that if there's so much to do with political will, then that is your connection. There's not enough money being used for it. And at the same time, we're attacking other countries. We are now a state at war, unfortunately. So if we're going to spend more money on defense, that decision always takes money away from other places. And this is what the trade-off is. Unfortunately, most African countries don't feel that economic, social, and cultural rights are as important as civil and political, but at the same time, the loopholes in the system still remain. And I think that whole push from the 1960s where, immediate realization, this can be done straight away, was a fallacy because we don't have right to fair trial in many African countries. We don't have rights to vote. So immediate didn't take place, and now if you try and look at progressive, then of course, there's no money going into economic, social, and cultural rights because the state can always argue, well, we haven't finished with the immediate one first, so let's do progressive later. And this is a problem. But again, civil and political rights are also not yet realized. So I tried to look at different projects that are building the link between tax and social welfare. And the one that stands out the most probably is the participatory budgeting processes that have emerged across the world that started in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And in different African countries, it exists in slightly different ways, but in some they have failed, and in some countries they seem to have done fairly well, but always with a lot of controversy. But why do I pick it? And the one that I pick is actually the Kenyan one. The legislation in the Kenyan one actually said very specifically, it was the first time I found legislation like this, that 7.5% of tax revenue, not government revenue, tax revenue specifically, would be allocated to these particular development projects or development funds. And then in the Development Fund Act, there was specific reference that it had to be education, infrastructure, and health. So they didn't use human rights language, but by using the word development, I think we can use right to development as an umbrella. And you have a situation where tax was being used specifically for development. Other countries don't use tax revenue. They will say budget or revenue generally without being more specific. But in Kenya, because they said tax, it was very easy then to show the link, because here was a direct connection. And this particular project, which is the Constituency Development Funds, was developed down at grassroots level and required community participation in order to make decisions on how the money was spent. Now, it was different from the Brazilian process because in Brazil, the people actually got to walk into the room and decide. But in Kenya, what happened was a committee got set up under the Member of Parliament, and this is where there's been a lot of controversy because many people feel that the Member of Parliament has actually taken money and not used it in the constituency. So there is that, of course, that dilemma there. But the beauty of it is that we've had development taking place in villages where they had no electricity and no water and no schools, because suddenly people were making decisions for their own benefit. And in other cases where money was being misused, we actually had a series of court cases where constituents were actually taking members of parliament to court, and members of parliament lost their positions, and in some cases the committee that they formed were disbanded. So we had one situation where a committee was set up by the member of parliament, his father, his uncle, his nephews. You get the picture. Well, they got taken to court and they were asked to actually be disbanded, and they had new elections in that constituency. So, of course, the democracy moves in fits and starts, and it's not a smooth process. It never has been. But there was now this beginning of a link to a democratic process within this whole tax and development discussion, which I thought was very interesting. But the other one that has been much older as well, and is mainly in gender-based budgeting now, so it's really the women's rights activists that have pushed it, and very effectively, and that is to actually take a state budget and to reanalyze it in a different way. And gender-based budgeting has been very effective because you're actually able to tell exactly where the money is going. And earlier I said that I think the right to health is very important. Well, the biggest cause of death under the right to health statistics is maternal mortality, and then, of course, children under the age of 5. And one of the things that the rights-based budgeting is beginning to show is also that if you spend more tax money on women and health, then you have more women surviving through the process of giving birth, and you have more children surviving after the age of 5. And these are statistics that are coming out very slowly, but are quite strong right now. But the rights-based budget analysis is very effective because you can go back to your government and say, look, this is how much you spent, and this was the effect. And this country spent this much, and look at this is a change in their statistics. So these statistics are now able to come out. But there is one difficulty there. And the difficulty is that usually any developing country that has a loan with the IMF and the World Bank have to follow accounting processes that are set out by the IMF and the World Bank, which are not going to be human rights-based processes. So that means that they're going to do their normal analytical analysis of their accounts, but you won't be able to see the rights-based analysis. So it means you have to take all the raw data and pull it out again and do it in a different way, which of course can take a very long time. But the gender-based budgeting has been quite effective so far. So ways to support increased domestic resource mobilization. I think that the gender budgeting process has been a very effective process. It's quieter in some ways, but it's more effective because you can actually come with statistics very quickly to government. And it means that there's more accountability and transparency. And I don't know how accountants will take this because they'll probably hate me for saying this, but I think they need to change how they're doing their accounts, so they have to relearn it somehow. But I really think that when you look at the budget of any nation state, you always have the tax revenue, of course, oil revenue or mineral revenues, then you have loans. And if you're a developing country or country that's taking an international loan, or you have overseas development assistance, then there's the aid. If you haven't got that, then you won't have that in your bundle. And on the other side, there's always housing and health and defense, but all of those have got human rights implications. Defense is the right to security. Housing is the right to housing. Education is the right to education. I mean, the way the budgets are structured don't necessarily mean that they're not rights-based. And sometimes I think that using finance is actually a win-win situation because you can actually show that, look, you built low-income housing. That actually qualifies under the right to housing. It is progressive realization. But if people don't make that connection in their minds, and of course governments in Africa have had a fairly antagonistic relationship with the civil and political rights over the years. And so they don't actually phrase it in a way that shows you that they're actually building more courthouses or hiring more judges, and that actually has an effect. That hostility is actually, I think, undermining the movement forward of human rights from a financial perspective. And I think rethinking that can be very useful. But I also think we have to change some of the loopholes in the law. I was reading the Washington Post yesterday, and they said that There's a new tax that the UK is going to apply. They're calling it the Google tax. I don't know if you've read about it. But the Google tax means they're going to implement more taxes on multinationals that they feel are avoiding or evading taxes. And then the response from one of the experts, I can't remember who it was that, well, no, they're just very effectively using existing laws. And I think that this is the crux of the matter. If the law exists, then people will use the law for their benefit. And in a sense, the argument that comes out is you can't blame them. So then the answer is actually, let's fix the laws, so that they can't do it. Once we discover it, a good way to move forward is to encourage legislative amendment. So I hope that was useful, and thank you very much.